Good morning, everybody, and welcome to St. Mark's Church. And my name is Bob, one of the pastors here, and I'm glad you're here. I've been listening to the old church basement song for a while, and it's not any better done on radio than it is right here. That was pretty good. By the way, so how many of you know we have an old church basement? Yeah, a few of you do. It's next door. I don't recommend it. It's the oldest part of this facility, literally in every way, because that basement was dug out before they put the sanctuary up. It is 75 years old this year. It smells funny, smells like a basement, smells like kids have been in it. Pretty much everybody's been in it for a long time, but when I go down there, it's a little dingy, but it brings back a whole bunch of memories. So about a month ago, I was having lunch with my friend, Brian Biggers. He's pastor over at Lamb's Chapel. And Brian, a few months ago, announced his retirement, so we were both in the same boat on that one. And I think Brian's been serving at Lamb's Chapel for, I don't know, maybe it's 15 or so years. And certainly if you know a little bit about that church, its growth speaks for itself. About 2 or 3 days after we had lunch, I bumped into an old buddy, and he said, "Hey, I saw you and Biggers the other day eating lunch." And he said, "I was surprised to see y'all eating together." He said, "I thought he was the enemy." And I looked back at him and I said, "We play for the same team. Did you miss that class?" Hey, listen up, everybody. If there's any confusion about it, I think there are around 300 or so churches in Alamance County, and we all wear the same jersey. There's the same name on the front and the back, and that name would be Jesus. This church and no other church. We're not in competition with each other in this community, period. And we need to start thinking that way. But we don't sit around in staff meetings or board meetings or elder meetings or anything and say, well, let's see how many other local churches in this community we can alienate. We don't do that because we need every one of them, and we need them to be as strong as they can be and certainly united. And every single time, you already know this, but whenever there's a heartbreaking moral failure or maybe some type of leadership malfunction and maybe a collapse in leadership, it's a stain that just kind of bleeds onto every local Christian church. Years ago, we were interviewing a potential member of our staff, and this person said, and he was from out of state, and he said, "I just got to know, is there a law in North Carolina that says there has to be a church on every corner?" And I said, "Well, you noticed that, have you?" And crazy, but then I said, you know what the crazy thing is? About 60% of this community never goes to one. And we're trying to figure that out. They're not invested in one. So the reason why maybe 115,000 people in this community who live within, now these are people that live within reasonable driving distance of this campus. One of the reasons they don't attend church is not because they can't find one, because they can locate one just about anywhere. And truthfully, it's really not about the fact that many of those people believe that the church is irrelevant or maybe somehow disconnected from real life. By and large, people outside the church don't participate because they believe that the church is for church people only. And it's not really for them. They think that church is like a club that religious people go to, where club members hang out and they do what club members like to do. And frankly, we do sometimes act like that, don't we? About 30 years ago, some of you remember this, American Express created a marketing slogan. You remember? Membership has its privileges, they said. And ever since then, there was something just kind of troubling about that for me, because I was wondering, is it the American church that has somehow perfected that type of membership? Several weeks ago, I was out on my bicycle, and I was on a country road over near McLeansville, and I noticed a sign that said Methodist Church. And there was an arrow pointing down a small country road that led to a church building. Now, I don't know that Methodist church, but I'll tell you what, I can almost guarantee you that some of the people in that church, they think like club members. And so they just say, down there is the clubhouse. But you know what? Most churches, many churches at least, have that same kind of mentality. For example, you think about what a typical church will give a person when they become a new member. They oftentimes give you the new member packet. And what's included in that infamous bag of goodies? You get a church directory, and that's where you can read all the names and addresses, and sometimes you'll see even pictures of all the club members. And then you'll get a church calendar, which is a list of all the club activities and a list of the club leaders, that would be the important club members. And of course, you're always going to get the bylaws. That would be the club rules. And then finally, there'll be this little box of offering envelopes inside, and it's an unspoken kind of thing, but it means that your club dues are payable immediately and often if you want to be a part of things here. Purpose of the new member packet is to explain to you, if you're new, here's what's really important, and here's how you can get the most out of club membership. Look, I meet with church leaders with some regularity, and so many of them are struggling and fighting uphill battles, and they're out there on the ministry front lines every single week, and my heart goes out to them. So I get to hear a lot of stories, and some of those stories are really good, and they're victorious kinds of stories, but then there are ones that trouble me, and the ones that hurt me the most are when pastors, and oftentimes it's when a younger pastor, and every pastor is young to me now, but when a younger pastor just decides to throw up their hands and they say, I quit. I'm not going to do this anymore. I met with a Baptist pastor a year before last, and this guy's got 30 years of experience, and he was incredibly discouraged, and just kind of called me out of the blue, and we were sitting together and just talking about ministry and what it means to give up and not do ministry anymore. And you know what the one incident was that broke his spirit? About a year before he came to see me, he agreed to baptize a man in his church whose wife was terminally ill, and they didn't know how long she might be able to live. And so this man decided that, he didn't want his spiritual integrity or his spiritual future to be hanging in the balance because his wife was pretty sick. And so he asked the pastor, he said, I'd like to be baptized. I want my wife to see this. So obviously the timing of this was important. About 2 weeks after the baptism, the deacons met with the pastor, and they told him that they had decided that this man's baptism was invalid because it had not been approved by the deacons and was a violation of church bylaws. So he quit. You know something, I've never had one pastor say to me, I'm quitting because of the unchurched people are getting to me. Do you know, as far as I know, not one single atheist has ever criticized me. They don't care. They don't care what I do or what I say. But some have said, I just can't take the club members anymore. Most of the people that you know who don't give the church a second thought, they're not bad people. Most of them are not doing bad stuff. They just have chosen not to be invested in a church because they think somehow or another it has become for members only. So about 30 years ago, we decided to take this older, well-established, mature, pretty effective church that's got a well-planted church basement, and we decided to make some changes in order that we might be able to figure out how we can open our arms a little bit wider and maybe put our arms around people who, for the most part, have little or no interest in becoming invested in what they perceive to be a club. Now, how crazy was that for us to take 100-and-some-year-old church and try to figure out how to make that happen? And here we are 3 decades later, and we've grown from a church of a few hundred to a church of thousands. And many of those people, many of you, some of you, before you were introduced to Christ through the ministries of this church, you didn't really give a rip about God. Never maybe even gave God a second thought. Only just a few years ago, could be. So there's a reason why we do church the way we do it. And so I decided that we would take a good portion of this fall ministry season and talk about the St. Mark's Church birthmarks. This church has birthmarks, and they've not gone away. Our church was born with these marks a long time ago, 160-some years ago. So I want to take a look at some of the SMC, some of the things that make us unique among churches. We're not better than any church, But in some cases, we're just different. Lots of things have and will change, certainly around here in the coming years. The building changes every now and then. The staff will change. The music will change. And I'll change. In fact, pretty soon I won't even be here. But there's some traditions that we live by that will never change. They're birthmarks. They were here the day this church was born a long time ago, and they're here to stay. Now, for many of you, if you've been here around here for a while, then you know this first one. We just say people matter to God. People matter to God. All people matter to God. Religious people, faithful people, those who have no faith at all, those who never think about God, people who live their lives by the golden rule, and those who believe that those with the gold make the rules. People who appreciate and celebrate God's margins and guidelines that He's laid out for us in His Word. And those who never crack open a Bible and are morally very careless and incompetent, and people with a biblical worldview. The Bible for me is like a lens, and I see everything in this life through that lens, and call me whatever you want to, but I have this biblical worldview that I'm not willing to sacrifice, and I see everything on the other side of that lens based on what God has taught in the scriptures, because this word is true and it's full of truth, and people matter to God. That's never going to change. We desperately want to be a safe place where all people know that they matter to God and to us. Let me illustrate that. Some years ago when our son turned 21, for his 21st birthday, he wanted to go to Washington, D.C. and tour the city. He had been there when he was in fifth grade. Some of y'all remember the fifth grade trip to Washington, D.C. So, well, I went on that trip. It was a nightmare. We even stopped at Monticello to see Mr. Jefferson's home, but they crammed in a 6-day trip in 36 hours. And so I volunteered to be a chaperone on that trip, but I made a deal with my wife, and I said, look, I'll do this trip, but when Mackenzie turns in fifth grade, then you go. Do you know what? I'm not making this up. Susan was sitting right there at the first service, and she was enjoying the moment. They didn't have that trip when Mackenzie was in the fifth grade. I mean, there's no justice in that now. I'm just going to tell you. But anyway, so we're in Washington, D.C., and at the time, we had a church member, a kid that had grown up here, really, and she was working as an assistant to one of the North Carolina senators, so she kind of had the inside track. She didn't have a key or anything like that, but, she could go pretty much anywhere she wanted to in the building. We got to see every nook and cranny of that historic building that was first opened up in the year 1800, believe it or not, in the month of November. So she took us all over the place. We went down into the basement. And she showed us, she uncovered this platform, and I touched it. I'm sort of a tactical, that type of person. So I touched it, but that's the platform on which they placed the body of Abraham Lincoln when he was in the rotunda in 1865. Same one that held the body of John F. Kennedy a century later in 1963. She took us in a room where they had several desks in this room. And, a president, I believe a president gets to choose whatever desk they want to use in the Oval Office. And she showed us Richard Nixon's desk. And she said, you've got to crawl under the desk. So went under the desk, and she said, do you see those two big holes there that his staff had created? That's where his aides, no kidding, not making this up, had run the wires for the recording machines. Very interesting, if you know a little bit about that history. We sat around the table where the heads of state sit before they go in to address the Congress. We got to walk out on the platform of both the Senate and the House of Representatives. And we also had this unique privilege of climbing the top to steps to the very top of the rotunda. And we walked out on the top of the Capitol dome where you could see the entire city. Susan hates heights. I thought it was awesome. You have to crawl kind of on the inside of the Capitol dome. Maybe you've done this, but this little place here is, you can walk, it's a 360 deal. You can walk all the way around, see just about everything from that place. Senators and Congress members were up and down, in and out of their office, but the one thing that I paid a special attention to was the security. You ever been to Washington, D.C.? There's a lot of security, and this was 3 years before 9/11. Well, during the week that I was there, I was running back in those days, and we were staying on the Capitol end of the mall. So I'd leave and go down the hill and run through the mall. And one day I thought, I'm going to take a right. I'm going to circle the White House. Just kind of a cool thing to do. So I go around the White House, and I'm going down starting to go down this side street beside the White House. And that's where I met a serious-looking security guard, and he had a gun, and his hand was on the gun. And I said, "You got bullets in that gun?" He said, "Yeah." And he said, "If you go down this alleyway here, I'm going to have to arrest you." I'm thinking, this is going to be a mess tomorrow in the Daily Times News back in Burlington. And I said, "Sir, I think I've got it. I think I fully understand." Now, here's my point. The guy with the gun was not very nice. He was kind of rude to me. And that's what they pay him to be rude, I think. And I got to thinking, that guy's like some church people I know. Church people, have you ever seen an angry church member? I have. Yes, everybody, I have. I've seen some. Some people have decided that, it is their appointed task in life to stand at the doors of a church and have their hand on their spiritual weapons because there's some people that don't belong here. You can't come here. I'm sorry because you're not like one of us, and you don't believe like what we believe, and you don't dress like we dress, and you don't like our kind of music, so you can't come here. Don't even think about it. About a decade ago, a woman showed up at one of our Christmas Eve services. And she told, I never met her, but she told one of our ushers a fascinating story. She was from out of town. She grew up in Burlington. She had been away lived several states from here. She was back home for Christmas. She radically unchurched, hadn't been in church in years. And she decided she said, it's Christmas Eve. It's the birthday of Jesus. I think I'll go to church tonight. And so she decided to attend the service in the church over in town where she grew up. And when she walked in the foyer of the church, one of the ushers noticed how she was dressed, and he said, "Excuse me, but I think you'd feel more comfortable in the balcony." And she said, "No, I'd really rather sit downstairs." And he said, "Ma'am, we don't allow jeans on the main floor of the sanctuary." Now, she looked at him and said, "Are you serious?" And she said, "You know what, sir, I think I'd feel better if I were not here at all." And do you know what he said to her? No kidding. He said, "If you'll go west of here, there's a church called St. Mark's and you might like it." So she did. So imagine if you can't wear jeans on the sanctuary floor, if somebody has the audacity to show up in a pair of jeans on the platform. Now, can you, Jesus is probably falling out or something like that. Let me tell you something, everybody. I've read the biographies of Jesus very carefully, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I don't ever find him treating people like that, do you? I just don't. So a long time ago, that settled it for us. People matter to God. What people? All people. I'm going to take you to Matthew chapter 2. Now, when I start reading this, some of you are going to say, "Bob, are you trying to get a jump on Amazon or Target for the 2021 Christmas season?" But give me a few minutes and I can explain this. Let's go to Matthew chapter 2. For the most part, many of you are going to be familiar with the story. Most of us have, if you've ever been in church a few times at Christmas. Some of you, I won't ask for a show of hands, but all of y'all remember the traditional children's Christmas pageant with the halos and the angel wings, and then the shepherds show up. How many of y'all were shepherds in the children's Christmas? We got all kinds of shepherds. I was a shepherd one time. The only other time I was in the pageant, I was a tree. I'm not kidding you. So they had this big cutout of a tree, and I had to stand behind it and hold it. And they said, try not to move because the tree is not supposed to move. Anyway, bad memory for me. But The children's Christmas program is never going to be complete without the guys who come bearing the gifts, the magi, sometimes referred to as the wise men. Now, we really don't know how many of them there were. Now, many of you are thinking, Bob, there were 3. I mean, how did you miss that? 1857, John Henry Hopkins wrote a song called We Three Kings. So there must be 3 kings. Well, it's not in the book, but anyway, sing Christmas carols and you kind of get it. I'm guessing, based on research, that there were probably more. I would think maybe somewhere between 10 and 15 because they would travel in larger caravans, but I don't know that it makes any difference to the story. Look, you make it however many you want to, and I'll be good with that. So I want to take you back to the story because I'm pretty confident there are a few things that some of you have missed and you never saw in the story. And I think that's going to help us to understand where we're going today as we think about the priorities that we have as a church. For example, number 1, all people matter to God. Here's what it says. Matthew chapter 2, Jesus was born in the town of Bethlehem in Judea during the time when Herod was king. When Jesus was born, some wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. They asked, "Where is the baby who was born to be king of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." Now notice those words. They say, "Where is the baby?" I remember a woman who said to me, obviously the reason we call them wise men is these were the first men in the history of the world that ever stopped and asked for directions. So you figure that out. Notice that it said these men came from the east. Most people believe probably from the country of Persia. I'll show you a map here. This is where they were headed. And here's Persia down by the Persian Gulf. So they had quite a hike. It was a pretty long trip that they had ahead of them. These men were philosophers, prophets, astrologers. They were like psychics, fortune tellers. They were most likely pagans, totally irreligious. This is important because oftentimes they're kind of portrayed in the story as being spiritual giants who just wanted to get close to God, and they traveled a long way to meet this newborn Messiah. Probably not. These men were most likely spiritually about as far from God as you can get. They were stargazers, for crying out loud. Astrology and horoscopes, and that was their thing. They worshiped the stars. Now, what this would suggest to me, though, is that from the very beginning of the Jesus story, God's intention was to reach people far from him. Because people matter to God. What people? All people. That's exactly right. Now, fast forward 30-some years after Jesus was born, he launches his public ministry. Who'd he hang out with? He rubbed shoulders with religious leaders, the spiritual A-team? Not likely. He stayed pretty clear from them. Newsflash. Jesus spent most of his time with the sick, the impoverished, the needy, the deprived, depraved, the immoral, the guilty, the misfits, marginalized, lepers, tax collectors, prostitutes, those whose moral character was suspect. Jesus spent a disproportionate amount of time with people who needed him most. He spent time with the broken, the bruised, the hopeless, people like us. I'll tell you what a woman told me years ago. She found out that I had built a recreational relationship with a man who was, he was out there. He was living right there on the edge, the ragged edge of immorality. And I didn't hang out with him, but I played ball with him and stuff and was trying to influence him. And she said, "You need to know that I'm kind of embarrassed to know that my pastor would be a friend of a person like that." And I said, "No kidding, really?" And I said, "Look, you need to know that I'm a big-time sinner myself. I married a sinner. I parented 2 sinners. I'm the pastor of the largest single collection of sinners in this town, and I'm friends with you. So hanging around sinners is not a big deal to me. You know, I'm kind of used to it." So, Bob, did you know that there's some people that come to St. Mark's Church who drink too much? Really? I can always count on Jeff, man. When you preach in this church and Jeff's in the room, there is no rhetorical questions. You never ask a rhetorical question. Bob, are you? Hey, I love you, Jeff. Bob, are you aware that there are people attending St. Mark's Church that are struggling with their sexual identity? You're kidding me. Bob, there are people attending this church and they're sleeping around. In this culture? Are you serious about it? Bob, there are teenagers in this church, and some are making reckless choices. And what if they poison some of the other kids? And I'm thinking, what if the opposite happens? Bobby, did you know there are people in your church that have had abortions? Come on, really? So, Bob, how do you feel about all that? I'll tell you how I feel about it. I don't know of any place in the scriptures where God says, I expect my church to be a safe haven where a bunch of saints can come and sit around and tell each other how much better they are than the moral screw-ups in the community, and how can we build enough thick walls to keep the ragtag riffraff from poisoning our club? And how can we keep them from wearing jeans in the sanctuary? The fact is, we're just a gigantic collection of used-to-bes. We used to be a lot of things until we met Jesus. And God is very clear. He would expect us to figure out ways to put our arms around the whole community for Christ, his son. That's exactly what we're determined to do. People matter to God. What people? All people. So we do whatever it takes. I meet people sometimes who, I'll bet you I've had this conversation 100 times. And they'll say, you know, I was talking to somebody and they told me that pretty much anybody can come to this church. And so they show up here because they'll say, I've never really heard of a church like that. I'm not sure about that. You want to know why? Because somebody, somewhere along the way, convinced them that church is for members only. Church people. So let me ask it this way. When was the last time you drove by ARMC, our local hospital? Did you ever drive by there and say, can you believe some of the people they let in there? I mean, they let drug addicts go in there. People with broken legs and people who have heart attacks and gunshots, and people who are victims of physical and emotional abuse. Can you believe they just opened the doors for people like that? Can you see how foolish that argument is? God never called us to put a screening team out there at the doors and then check people's backgrounds and check their membership cards. How insane would that be? God has selected his local church to broadcast the love, mercy, forgiveness, and grace of Jesus. And that's what we do, and that's what we will do, because here's what we know. God transforms people from the inside out. It's not the outside in. It's not the outside behaviors that change first. It's that inside transformational thing that then eventually starts to bleed into lifestyle decision-making and all the rest. Hundreds of examples in this church. Sometimes a well-meaning person will ask me, Bob, do you know that there are people at our church who don't know anything about the Bible or Jesus or prayer? Sure, I know that. I mean, but those are almost always the questions that your typical club members ask. So what if people like that come in here and they mess up our church and we have to clean it up? You know what I always say? We've got a lot of former messed up people, and they just stand around and they'll clean up the next mess whenever it happens. A church that believes that it's for members only, they would expect people to be trained, and, they want people trained to do what members do. It was just never God's idea. Let's go back to Matthew 2, just for a moment. This is not a trick question, so you can answer out. You don't even have to be Jeff to answer out on this one. So, how did God get the attention of these star watchers? Well, the right answer would be a star. They follow a star. I think that's pretty cool. God, look, did you notice God did not send a theologian, a pastor, church leader, elder, Sunday school teacher? That's not the way God worked in with those guys. Stargazing was their hobby. They were obsessed with astrology. So God, in his wisdom, he just turns on his creativity and he produces a bright star because he knew that's where those men were looking already. Why do something over here when they're looking here? One of the reasons why we try to be as creative as we can in our weekend services It's because we serve a creative God. Occasionally somebody will say, Bob, you use a lot of props. By the way, my jeans are the props today. I couldn't come up with anything else, so you just have to figure that out. You use a lot of props, and sometimes y'all use video illustrations. And so why do y'all do that? Same reason Jesus did. That's all. He was a compelling teacher, had a great imagination. He used props and object lessons, show and tell. Can you remember some? I don't have time to mention them all. Wildflowers and birds, mustard seeds and fig trees and little kids and grapevines. And one time he said, hey, anybody have a coin that I can borrow? And let me show you. We're not afraid to use any of the resources that God has put into our fingertips. Let me see if I can illustrate that. So when you decide you're gonna go to a movie, so you go to the theater, buy a couple of tickets to see the movie, you mortgage your house to get the popcorn and the soft drinks. But when you sit down, you expect that there is gonna be creativity on the screen. Yes? Absolutely. Let me tell you, one of the highlights of living in North Carolina, and I just met some people after the first service from southern Florida in the Miami area, and they just can't wait for fall in North Carolina because they've never seen it before. So we get to experience seasonal changes. It feels good whenever the summer heat and humidity give way to cool mornings. And it's one of God's creative ways. Every now and then God just takes a paintbrush, and just colors the sky. So I was in Boone for the last couple of days with the Elon football team. And yesterday morning, just right after the sun came up, I was sitting outside of our team hotel, and I drinking some coffee, and I thought, that's the first I've seen. So I snapped a picture and sent it to Susan and said, welcome to fall. And it's gonna be amazing what happens in just the next few weeks. Many of you enjoy reading novels, and you crave the suspense and the creativity. You just can't turn the pages fast enough. Most of us in here applaud creativity in every area of life. So why is it that some people want to be critical when we try to get creative in the church? So 2,000 years ago, God rearranged and repositioned the stars to get the attention of a small group of stargazers who were beginning to ask some simple spiritual questions. For me, I just happen to think that's cool. You figure that out for yourself. We believe that we have a much better chance of reaching somebody for Christ if we can engage their brain, their intellect, and their emotions, and their laughter, and their applause than we would if we sit in a church and people are just making out their grocery list or sending text messages or checking their Instagram. And I don't see any signs anywhere out there on the horizon that SMC is gonna just kind of pull back and cease using our creative energies to make a difference for Jesus. We serve a God who is imaginative and creative, and he wants to engage brain and heart and spirit and emotions. I don't know why we sometimes want to hang on to the 11th commandment. You know what the 11th commandment is? You shall not have fun in church. Well, let's get rid of that one. Here's the second thing. Let's go back to the story. The Magi roll into Jerusalem. Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was troubled, as well as all the people in Jerusalem. Herod called a meeting of all the leading priests and teachers of the law, that would be the religious, the A-team, and asked them where the Christ would be born. They answered, in the town of Bethlehem in Judea. The prophet wrote about this in the scriptures, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah are important among the tribes of Judah. A ruler will come from you who will be like a shepherd for the people of Israel. So these magi, they get to Jerusalem. They're looking for this king. They mention it to Herod. He decides to call a meeting. That's what religious people do. They scheduled a leadership summit. Herod assembles all the Bible experts. They put their heads together, and one of them says, the prophets say that the Messiah would someday come from the town of Bethlehem. Look, am I the only person in this room that wonders why these religious leaders didn't just get up and walk to Bethlehem and find out for themselves if there was some hoopla about a newborn baby? It was 5.5 miles, for crying out loud. Why didn't they just go there? Let me see if an illustration can help. When I was a kid back in the 50s and 60s, growing up here in the South, there was a family tradition, and some of you will remember this. When we visited the relatives, we didn't call ahead. I mean, why would you call ahead? You just showed up. And what did they say? Hey, y'all come on in. And we'd visit for a while, and then after a while, my parents would say, well, we better get going. They didn't mean that. They said it, but they really didn't mean it. What they meant is, it's time to start getting ready to go. We're going to leave, but we're not going to leave now, but we're going to start getting ready to leave. And so we stood up and we grabbed our coats, but it wasn't really time to go. In fact, sometimes we would get to the door, maybe 10 or 15 minutes after we first said we were going to go. And then what would my parents say to the relatives? Hey, why don't y'all come and go with us? Now, my dad would have freaked out if the relatives would have gone with us. He didn't really mean that. But then because the relatives would have said, I believe we will. What y'all having for supper tonight? Or something like that. No, they didn't really want the relatives to go. They just said it. And then you know what the relatives would say when you were walking to the car? Hey, don't wait so long to come back, y'all. We like being close to the relatives. Just not that close. Y'all, you know what I'm talking about. That's what's going on in this story in Matthew 2. These church leaders, deeply religious people. And right at that moment, they were closer to God than they had ever been before. They were 5.5 miles from the Son of God, but close didn't matter, you see, because their hearts were hard and closed and poisoned by all kinds of religious traditions. For the next 30-some years, these church leaders had a chance to get to know Jesus, but it was too risky because, you see, Jesus might sabotage their power and control. There are people all across this city, some of you, and they grew up in a church. Or maybe they've been around church their whole life long. But many never have had a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Memorize the prayers, the creeds, the songs, but if you say, so how do you have a personal relationship with Jesus? They can't tell you, and that's trouble. I was that way until I was 17 years old. I had a great relationship with church, no relationship with Jesus. So we don't want to be a church accused of having hundreds of people who just have a little hour and 15-minute visit with God every week, but they never really know him as Lord, Savior, Redeemer, forgiver of sins, and leader of life. There's an old cliche, you've heard it, that close only counts in horseshoes. We're not interested in just helping people get close to Jesus, but to develop a personal, life-giving relationship with him. People matter to God. What people? All people. That's not going to change. Not now, not ever. It's not debatable. It's not up for grabs. But we also recognized decades ago that the power of God changes lives. Let me illustrate that. One of the candidates for our lead pastor position asked one of our staff members a few weeks ago, so what do you think Bob's greatest weakness is? And without hesitation, just like that, ice cream. That's what they said. And it's no lie. I mean, y'all know that. I do like ice cream. I'm not addicted to it. Some of you think I am. I'm not. I think in this year, probably in this calendar year, and it's September, I've probably not had a cup of ice cream this entire year. So one of the ways I limit myself is I just tell Susan, don't bring it in the house. She's pretty dependable about that sort of thing. Works like a charm. Just happens that way. Don't buy it, I don't eat it. But now one of the families in our church, younger family, they're from Cincinnati, Ohio. And every now and then, they were at the first service. They will bring me Cincinnati's renowned ice cream called Grater's. It's the name of the company, Grater's Ice Cream. Now, the first time they brought me some Grater's from Cincinnati, they told me it was the best ice cream in the world. You know why? Because that cone of ice cream right there has 400 calories and 30 grams of fat. That is some very sophisticated junk food. I'm not kidding you. Now, you can overdose on that in a matter of a couple minutes. You can be on overdose, and then you're going to get brain freeze. By the way, now, and I can't believe how many people ask me about this. So if you'll talk to me after church, I'll tell you how to prevent brain freeze. Okay? So I'm not going to take the time to do it now, but I know I've got the antidote to brain freeze, and you can eat ice cream as fast as you want to, no brain freeze. So a few months ago, after I had a stent put in my heart, somebody wanted to know if that artery was clogged up with ice cream or Lexington barbecue. So you know what I said? Yes, that's right. But some of you know what that feels like spiritually, don't you? We've OD'd on some hard stuff in life. There are people walking this building every single weekend, and they have just been pressed down by some of the life challenges more than we can imagine. Every Sunday, somebody comes in this place and they carry a bunch of pain. It could be substance addiction that has just unraveled their heart. Marriage maybe has ended in a painful divorce. Sometimes it's a physical challenge, or some chronic pain that just will not leave them alone. It might be an emotional scar from a season or two in the past that's just crushed their spirits. I recently spoke to a person who had a moral collapse and violated the relationship with the people that they love the most, and the guilt and shame is just about to undo them. Some people carry deep grief that tortures them for a long time, steals every attempt that they make to go to sleep. Listen, then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. Now, some of you are familiar with that part of the story. Let me tell you something. Herod had no intentions of ever going to revere or respect Jesus. In fact, to the contrary. If you've ever studied anything about Herod, he was a narcissistic egomaniac. He was a schizophrenic. He would do anything, including having some of his own family members slaughtered. He would do anything to maintain power and control. So I don't know where you come down on this one, but at least I don't want you to be naive. I think of it, maybe, when was it that I did a whole series on spiritual warfare? I'm telling you, the enemy is poised to attack, is already in the business of attacking. He is taking more people out of the game than you can imagine. Sometimes he can take a church right out of the race. Here's something you can count on. Mark it down. The more people around here who bow their knee to Christ, the more who get baptized, the more people sign up for re-engage or divorce care or financial peace classes, the more people engage in Bible studies, the more people just put a serving towel over their arm and they get involved and engaged as a volunteer, the more people pray, the more people write checks to help us accomplish the work of God in the world. You can count on it. The more we do that, the more pressure that our enemy is going to bring to bear on us. Just 3 weeks ago today, we gathered at Lake Kamak. We baptized 87 people. It was an incredible afternoon. I was in the water for 3 hours. I was just having a blast. But I'll tell you, when we got in the car to drive home, I told Susan, I said, mark my words, Susan, the evil one is already planning a rebellious counterattack right now. And he's going to come after us because he hates that. If we're doing what God has called us to do and lives are changing, then you can count on it. There are going to be battles and decisive resistance and intense opposition. But I'm telling you, if God can protect a tiny baby in a small village like Bethlehem, he's got us. He's got it. Verse 11. Once again, the star appeared to them, guiding them to Bethlehem. They entered the house where the child and his mother Mary were, and they fell down before him and worshiped him. Let me tell you something about this church. With the exception of doing illegal things, we'll do anything to make Jesus famous. Anything, whatever it takes, we're willing to do it. Well, why do you think that about 20 years ago, this church spent $7.5 million to build this building and the accompanying children's space? You think we were tired of the old space? Is that why we did it? No way. Let me tell you something, everybody. In 1998 and 99, when we started making plans and imagining this addition, everybody that came here, we all had seats, we had parking spaces and programs for our kids. 4 weekend services. I agree, it was a little bit tight, but we were figuring it out. We were getting by. We built this place and we stretched ourselves out for people that we did not even know yet. Some of you, we didn't know who you were, but we knew you'd come here one day because we wanted you to know what we know. We wanted you to have the hope that we have, and that demanded more space. And then just 2 years ago, we decided that, we were having some problems in the children's area, so we added some new space. About $4.5 million was that project. Hey, look, we were getting by with kids' ministries. They had some classes out in the hallways and stuff. It was a little awkward, but we were getting by. But then we decided we'll stretch ourselves out again because Jesus is in the life-changing business, and we don't believe that he's done with us yet. You? And sometimes we think, hey, probably the best days are still ahead. By the way, we moved into that space out there in November of 2020, not even a year later. It was a $4.5 million project. We owe $1.1 million on that debt. That's all. That's not much. Why don't we knock it out? Let's just get it done. People matter to God. What people? God still has the power to change lives. Here's one more thing. We believe that God's word still has transformational power. God warned the wise men in a dream, do not go back to Herod, so they returned to their own country by a different way. God clearly communicated, this is the way you should go, gentlemen, and they followed the plans and directions and purposes and priorities of God, and end of story. A few months ago, I received this email. I attended your church today for the 4th Sunday in a row. And so far, you've used a lot of scripture. I was told by a coworker that you all don't preach the gospel, that it's watered down, but I haven't found that to be true. P.S. My coworker has never attended SMC. Why am I not surprised? Those questions prompt us a simple answer. We believe this book is true. We believe this book contains the truth about God, all of it, because here's what Paul writes. All scripture is inspired, all of it, and is useful for teaching, for showing people what is wrong, and for correcting their faults, and for teaching them how to live right. I can't explain everything to you there is in this book. There's a whole lot of things we can't explain. But let me tell you something. I cannot explain to you how a black cow eats green grass and produces white milk. But I drink milk. I don't have a clue what makes my car work. But I drive it every day. I can't explain it, but I drive it. We believe that Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be. We believe that he was worthy of our full devotion. Someday, we believe someday he's going to come back and he's going to fix this thinking world once and for all. We believe that this word has power to supernaturally transform people's lives if they decide to live by it. In fact, I would almost wager, if I were that type of person, I would wager that every stupid, dishonest, immoral, careless, and reckless thing we ever did was a violation of this book. Every time. So we hold this word in high regard. We treat this as a love story between God and the people that he cares about. And I'm telling you, everybody, nothing excites us anymore than to get to introduce him to as many people as we can. I hope you will sign on with us and help us to continue to make him famous. You in? All right.